Well, perhaps we can start. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this panel today organized by the Center for Cultural Identity and Education and co-sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies, Interdisciplinary Studies Graduate Program, the Department of Education and Counseling Psychology and Special Education. The theme for today's panel is Freire for Today, New Directions in Critical Pedagogy. My name is Handel Wright, and I'm the director of the Center for Cultural Identity and Education. And this panel is almost a happenstance. It is a result of, you know, the kind of overabundance of resources that sometimes drop like manna from heaven. And I just want to introduce the panel very quickly. This session comes together primarily because of Anna Cruz. Anna is here as a visiting scholar at the center, and she was going to give a talk as a visiting scholars do. And I was mentioning to Vanessa Andreotti, my colleague, that, we have somebody from Brazil here. And she says, oh, there's somebody else from Brazil who's here. Well, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And his name is Walter Cohen, and he's kind of interesting. And I looked him up, and I thought, oh, he's very interesting. He's doing work on Freire too, and whatever. And so the idea began to germinate in my mind. Of course, Sam here is a member of the department, and he held a conference on Freire last year that was very successful. And the idea started to germinate of beginning to put this together in some way. And Vanessa was very supportive of this idea, and so was Sam. And so I've kind of pulled people together, and I was very pleased that Walter was equally willing to participate. And I think this panel for me is exciting in various ways. First of all, I mean, I learned my Freire a long, long time ago. And people think of Freire as sort of like an origin of critical pedagogy, like where you go to see where it began before you do the really interesting theoretical stuff. And that's the way that Freire became portrayed, at least if I don't date myself too much, in the 90s, right? That's how people started to think of Freire in North America. So what is exciting about this panel? When I met Anna, I know Anna from when she was a graduate student at the University of Tennessee. Now she's a full professor. She was somebody working on Freire very seriously in a way that maybe a lot of people in North America were not doing anymore, who claim to be doing critical pedagogy. So we've gone from critical pedagogy, taking up Freire as just an originary moment, out of which you then move on to do the real work, which was because of that intervention of the postmodernism, post-structuralism, and people say, oh, Freire is way too simple with his idea of oppressor and oppressed, and banking pedagogy and teacher as co-learner and whatever. And so I think the idea of this entire conference on Freire and people who were ready to theorize about Freire that Sam held is one of the ways we begin to rethink things. And Anna's work has always made me think maybe somewhat differently about Freire and his place, especially the fact that she's attempting to bring Freire into thinking about diversity and deaf education and how that intersects with cultural studies. Potentially very exciting work. And so the work of Walter, the work of people like Vanessa, and especially, as Sam said, people who've read Freire in the original Portuguese, right? And are taking him and his theorizing very seriously. I think for me, this is a moment, a shift, which is why I call this Freire for today, right? The old way in North America, at least, of thinking of Freire needs to go, and we need to take Freire very seriously again. And my understanding is that Freire is actually under attack in Brazil currently. So when you're under attack, there must be a reason why. There's something in his work that still resonates with us. That means his work is still important. If we really believe in social justice, I believe that we still ought to be reading Freire, even if we only read him in English. So we're very lucky today to have three presenters. You've seen the posters, so I won't go into people's backgrounds. I'll just say that Ana Cruz is professor at San Diego College in Missouri and a visiting professor at the CCIE. That's Ana Cruz. She'll speak first. And then Dr. Walter Cohen is a professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro and is a visiting professor at ECPS. And Dr. Sam Rocha is assistant professor of philosophy of education in our own Department of Educational Studies. And Dr. Vanessa Andreotti has agreed to be discussant. She's professor in educational studies also here at UBC. So with that as something of an introduction, we'll have the three papers and then maybe some discussant comments from Vanessa, and then we'll open up and hopefully we'll have some discussion from the rest of you. So thank you very much. So.
Well, I will start also with thank yous. And I wanted to thank the Center for Cultural Identity and Education, especially Professor Dr. Andrew Wright, for his attention to my work and for basically believing that what I'm doing is something really important to share. So I thank him very much for bringing me as a visiting scholar here and being my host. I also wanted to thank the Department of Education and Studies, Dr. Ali A. Abdi, for his support. And I wanted to thank my colleagues. I wanted to thank Dr. Walter Cohen, Dr. Sam Rocha, and Dr. Vanessa Andreotti. Thank you. And I wanted to also thank very much the supporting staff. Erica Hughes, the assistant department head, has been fantastic in supporting and taking care of all my needs. Alexander Wozni also. And so the whole department, the whole family at UBC, they have been very welcome. So I wanted to thank you. So I will start my presentation, and I ask my colleagues to please give me some hint when I have 5 minutes left, because I am a Brazilian and Brazilians like to talk. So that is my biggest sin, okay? So give me 5 minutes when I basically have that much to talk. I wanted to start my presentation by making some connections to Vancouver, okay? Vancouver, as I look at my title, Silence is an Empowerment and Culture Mark, Critical Pedagogy and a Path Toward Critical Deaf Studies. Vancouver has been actually a very central location connecting deaf studies and critical pedagogy through the person of Paulo Freire. So in 2010, Vancouver hosts the 21st International Congress of the Education of the Deaf, on education of the deaf. And this was a very important conference because they wrote what they call a new era statement that pretty much refuted what was done to deaf education and to the deaf population with the Congress in Milan in 1880. That Congress was amazingly impact the lives of deaf people around the world, because this was when they decided that sign language should not be the form of education for deaf people, but instead oralism. So you need to educate deaf people by basically teach them how to speak. And so these really create a big change, not just the educational process itself, but the whole social structure, the way that you look at deaf people. Deaf teachers had to basically be let go because, of course, deaf teachers could not speak, and a new process of hiring of oral teachers became, and those oral teachers did not know how to communicate with deaf people. So you can just imagine what a big impact the Milan Convention of 1880 had in the lives of deaf people. And then in 2010, with that new era statement, they basically go back to, again, like I said, have a resolution that brings back sign language. They wanted to bring back the right to sign, and they want also to have what they call a section, a core for the future, that they call on all nations to respect the human rights of deaf people and to, with that, respect their language. And also Paulo Freire, going back to Vancouver and particularly UBC, was teaching here this summer 1984. And he taught a course during the month and was called Adult Education. And also Freire basically had, with Ira Shaw, we found out not so long ago, conversations that were the root for the A Pedagogy for Liberation, Dialogues and Transform Education. So Ira Shaw and Paulo Freire start dialoguing the, what became the book here at UBC. And also we have a very interesting article by Bouchier that is called Freire at the Beach, Remembering Paulo Freire in the Bright Days of Summer, that really brings to life the person that Paulo Freire was. Not just his work, but who was that man, Paulo Freire. So the connection to Vancouver I thought was very interesting to make. So then, yeah, I have here a little bit of the Congress and the book about Pedagogy for Liberation. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about why do we have this presentation today, why I came about becoming interested in deaf studies and linking that to critical pedagogy. It has a little bit to do with my personal journey. My past life, what I call, I used to be a musician, played the piano, classical piano, and I was a professor in Brazil, an assistant professor of the University of Amazonas, when I was approached through community service by a father of a deaf, congenital deaf girl, and they were a family of musicians, and she was the only deaf girl in the family. She wanted to learn how to play the piano. And he could not find anybody in town that would commit to teach his daughter how to play the piano. Just imagine a father who is a musician, whose daughter is very interested in learning music. How could he tell her, no, you can't, right? So he went in that particular search of who could do it. At that time, I had finished a program in special education that looked a little bit at deafness, but not too much in the sense that I would be able to understand music and deafness. So I basically said to the father, I have been teaching a lot of youngsters, and I will treat your daughter just like another one of my students who happened to have a difference. So there it was. After 1 year, she was playing piano like you could not tell that she had hearing limitations. And that really intrigued me. That brought me to my attention, and we basically brought me to the United States to have my graduate studies done at the University of Tennessee, looking at that particular idea that deaf people cannot do this, deaf people cannot do that, and that situation of oppression. So who decides who can do music and who cannot do music? Who can decide who is going to be a musician, who is not? So it really intrigued me. And in my graduate studies, I basically rediscovered and reimagined the work of Paulo Freire that I had started reading as I was a high school student. Okay? So, and with that can do this, can do that, that oppressed situation, I basically had a little bit of a poem here done by Willard Madsen during the process of the Deaf President Now, which was a movement that really changed the life of deaf people, and also was the seed for what you call the ADA, American Disabilities Act. So they wanted to have a deaf president as their representative. And this basically was a big ordeal during that time. But what was interesting, that poem that he says, we have been oppressed for years and years. It's always been the same. You are deaf. You can do this, you can do that. And the so-can't syndrome imposed on us by hearing world majority who did not want to see deaf people achieving full equality. Basically resonated to my time with the deaf girl. So this is where basically we come from. I just wanted to make sure that this was also brought to you. And then, like I said, music is a very important part of my life. And I wanted to make sure this would be something that could be shared also with deaf people. Not a way of imposing on their music, but if they choose to be part of music, they should be able to do so and not having auditorial limitations being an obstacle. Okay, so Lucian Price basically had a poem in which he tried to describe what music is, and I'm going to just mention at the very beginning to you, no one actually knows what music is. It is performed, it's listened to, it's composed and talked about, but its essential reality is little understood as that of its first cause, electricity. So basically, and then he goes on to say, perhaps the explanation is that music is the very stuff of creation itself. So that is how beautiful music is, and I could not avoid basically sharing the beauty with somebody else. So, silence and music. Let me just share with you here something that I do not know if you're familiar with John Cage. John Cage has a piece called 4:33, or 4 minutes and 33 seconds. How many of you are familiar with that piece? Okay, so let's just watch what happens when John Cage composed this piece. Hopefully everything is there. I'm not going to show the whole 4 minutes and 33, but...
And now, a performance of John Cage's 4:33. Please welcome our soloist, William Marks.
So this was the end of the first movement, and now the second movement is pretty much the same. So what John Cage was exploring is the silence that basically can bring together sounds from the audience that he incorporated as part of what he calls music. So the whole first movement, basically the pianist doesn't play, but the pianist involves in the process of music the whole quote-unquote background noise, if you will, that becomes part of what John Cage defined out as music. So that is the challenging always about the concept, what is silence, what is sound, what is music, and that whole relationship. That whole relationship of sound and silence. Basically, the piece, the music is composed basically by, say, first, second, third movement, and the pianist or the instruments basically read, pass it, and they count the minutes for the 3 movements. Okay, so. Then, as a Brazilian, I need to talk a little bit about the issue of silence through poetry, through the other way that music is present through rhythm. So I chose an excerpt from Carlos Drummond de Andrade, another Brazilian, where he, through the constant dialogue basically says, I'm going to read in Portuguese. I made the translation in English for you. I wanted to listen to the sound of the Brazilian language, as Paulo Freire talks. It's the Brazilian language, not Portuguese, okay? Escolhe o teu diálogo e tua melhor palavra ou teu melhor silêncio. Mesmo no silêncio e com o silêncio, dialogamos. So, basically in silence there is dialogue. And that brings us, of course, to our whole understanding of deafness and the discussion of deafness. What is that? So if you look at the history and the whole social construction of deafness, which is the approach that I will take in the presentation, deaf people have changed in the way that they were perceived by society throughout the history. From, quote-unquote, enlightened being, close to the celestial bodies, or God, if you will, because they were born with the privilege to know what silence was. So if you wanted to perfect the soul, you basically need to immerse in silence. And these people were privileged to basically be surrounded and immersed in silence. So they went from holy being to what you know nowadays of people who basically are perceived from the medical model as a deficit, as people who are broken, who need to be fixed. Okay, so the medical model is really based on that concept of ableism and what we also call audism, the superiority, that the ones who can listen are better off, are more complete, are holy in the sense of completeness, and have the right to decide for the ones who are broken what needs to be done, and for them to function in society, for them to construct an identity. So there is a lot of discussions throughout history and the debate, including the concept of normalization, what is normal and what is disabled, and even looking at the symbolic violence through Bourdieu and all that, and what is it that we have done to deaf people. So they have been marginalized and they have basically been an oppressed group in our society. So, and we have about 70 million people worldwide who are deaf. And you have about 300 plus sign languages in the world. So that brings us to the concept of deaf community. So deaf community is definitely not homogeneous. A lot of people think, oh, just deaf people. Yeah, and they use sign language, and that sign language is shared worldwide. No. Every community, every country has basically the different sign languages, and that is marked by cultural values, and the significance of sign language is basically what puts everything together in the deaf community, the identity, the deaf pride. And there is a strong culture that looks that silence is not a deficit. Silence is basically a cultural difference. That is what silence is, okay? So then we come with concepts of deafhood and deaf game. We are going to explore that a little bit. So let me show you a little bit about deaf community speaks. A little bit of a diversity in the deaf community.
Dear hearing people, we have some things to tell you about us. Sometimes we use a different language to communicate. Sometimes we can speak.
Sometimes we don't. Some of us like to wear hearing aids or cochlear implants to hear. Some of us need interpreters to communicate with others. Please don't force us to wear hearing aids or lip read for your benefit.
That is our personal and private choice.
Don't make decisions for us without our participation or permission. You'd be shocked. We are doctors, lawyers, filmmakers,
race car drivers, teachers,
inventors, CEOs,
chefs, video gamers, musicians, singers,
comedians, writers, and parents. Need we say more?
Sometimes we're perfectly happy being who we are.
Most of the time, Our struggles in society occur when other people make it difficult for us. Sometimes we are too tired to explain ourselves. We suggest
that you simply ask us questions and be open.
Don't be scared. Don't run away. Running away only means that you'll continue to not understand us.
That lack of understanding will only hurt us more.
We're human beings with thoughts and feelings, just like anyone else.
Just say hello, okay? So that is the idea. So, like I mentioned, ASL is not a universal language, and every country has, like Brazilian Sign Language, Libras, British Sign Language, BSL, the French Sign Language, LSF, the German Sign Language, DGS, and the list goes on. I also wanted to say that within these communities, there's also variations of language, sign language, just like we have variations of a spoken language. We have, for example, in America, we have what we call Black ASL, which is basically a different way that Black people look and sign and interact with the world and with themselves. And there is some deaf researchers now looking at Black ASL through historical time and basically looking at when it became and look at the segregation time in the United States, where hearing people and deaf people could not be together in the same school. So that at that time, there we start a variation on sign language. And believe it or not, the white deaf kids many times felt that they were, again, superior to the Black deaf kids. So that whole idea of race and the impact of race is also part of that heterogeneity of the deaf community. So it's not basically a one-size-fits-all in matter of language and culture. And I'm going to share one more, and then I stop here. In matter of empowerment and in matter of who we are as deaf people, I wanted to listen to this boy.
I feel strong as a deaf person. I'm not always feeling negative. Oh, I wish I was hearing. No, I feel strong as a deaf person. I prefer being deaf. Some people think being deaf is less than being hearing. No, I feel empowered as a deaf person. I prefer to be deaf because every time I yell or try to talk for myself, it feels uncomfortable. I don't like it. I prefer signing. I feel signing is more engaging. Hearing people are stuck with English, with talking. I don't like it. I prefer expressing myself in sign language. I can use shortcuts and describe things in a visual, three-dimensional way. That's why I like being deaf. There are stereotypes about being deaf. I get that sometimes, but I say no. Deaf people can do a lot. I show them what I can do. I explain it. If I were to stereotype hearing people like that, how would you feel? It's the same thing. You wouldn't like being labeled negatively if you were deaf. I wish hearing people didn't feel like being deaf is bad, that we are less than, or that being deaf is an illness. I wish they didn't feel pity. There's no need for that. I'm fine. Deaf people are fine. We don't need implants. We're fine. Just teach us sign language and be positive and not like, what do we do with this deaf person? They're awkward, when really it's no big deal. If they're saying, oh, you need an implant, don't let the doctor, audiologist, or teacher decide for you. You can decide for yourself. You can get information on the internet. You can think for yourself. You don't have to just accept that the doctor tells you you need an implant. No, you have a right. Deaf people have a right to equality. So
as you see, the theme comes back again. Our rights, right for equality, And I want you to really keep that in mind as you move toward the discussion of critical pedagogy and deaf studies, okay? So deaf studies basically came about, established in the 1970s, and it's basically a US and UK type of field, established field. And in this particular field of study, deaf people look at the ontologies, language praxis, arts, forms, so everything that affects the lives of deaf people. And they divide that in 3 waves. The first wave being basically that phase where sign language was studied and sign language was claimed to become a language. So signs were not considered language before Stock was a hearing professor at Gallaudet University who was curious about sign, and then basically said it's not just random gestures. Actually, there is a grammar behind, it's a very sophisticated language. So this was what they call the first phase, the first wave of deaf studies, where there were a comparison and a contrast between the deaf world and the hearing world. The second wave, from the 1990s to the 2000s, basically explored the idea of the visual ways of being and emphasize now marginalized deaf diversity groups, like when we talk about race, gender. They start emphasizing, discovering, and investigate more the diversity within the deaf community. And the third wave, which you are right now, basically emphasize more and more the ontology and epistemology of deaf people. Now you have a generation of scholars who actually are deaf. So you are looking at deaf studies from the epistemologies of deaf scholars who are basically doing research and not basically figuring out what is it that deaf people do because they are deaf themselves. So it's a new way now that the field is shaping itself. So it's broadening the academic reach. So that is basically a very important concept in the field of deaf studies, the search of deafhood, and it was pretty much established by Pedagogy, one of the protagonists of deaf studies that says understanding deaf culture in search of deafhood. And basically it presents a process where deaf individuals explain themselves and each other based on their own existence in the world. So again, they are part of a community, they are engaged in daily praxis, and they have an internal and external dialogue. What is interesting about Pedagogy is that actually he is exposed to pedagogy of the oppressed, and he has read Freire himself. So you see that some of the language he used, praxis, and all that, it's a language that he borrowed a little bit of Freire, but this is not an area that is fully explored, that is looked in depth, okay? So the deaf and deafhood, we have terminology, you have like, when you talk about deafness, as a pathological state, we talk about angry, crazy people. Deafhood, you say you're passionate, or the things you like. Now we have the medical, pathological, and deafhood has the linguistic, cultural, health, normal. And the deafness, look at ear, and the deafhood looks at whole being, focus. So then we go to the idea, the concept of deaf game. Deafness is not a deficit. Deaf is a game, because this is a different way that we engage with the world. And that different way of engaging with the world, there is actually a little anecdote that I wanted to talk to you about. There was a coach that was teaching a group of professional skiers, and basically he noticed that they always look at, they rely when they were skiing to the sound of how things were moving, and he said, no, I wanted to have some earplugs, and I wanted to feel you skiing, going downhill with your whole body. And actually what happened, there was a huge improvement in the performance of the skiers. So that's the concept of deaf game. You look at the world differently. You are not better or worse, you're just different. So then what Paulo Freire and the idea of critical pedagogy, how do I bring that all together, is that concept that Donaldo Macedo also says, critical pedagogy is a state of becoming, a way of being in the world and with the world, a never-ending process that involves struggle, pain, but also hope and joy, shaped and maintained by a humanized pedagogy. And this is an evolving term. I want us to understand that critical pedagogy cannot be written in stone. Critical pedagogy does not necessarily need a definition. It needs an understanding, because it evolves with context, with the people you work with, and who is working with the people. So, the Freire's concept of conscientization is an integral part of what we call critical pedagogy. And in a chapter that I wrote, I basically made a reference to the root of the word. There is a new noun that is created in Brazilian Portuguese. Conscientização, which is basically the process of raising somebody's awareness. It's not as translated to English, critical awareness only. It's the process, a process that evolves. Freire says there is a process in which men, not as recipients, but as knowing subjects, achieve a deepening awareness both of the social culture, reality, and that shapes their lives, and the capacity to transform that reality. Okay? So it's an active process. I propose that through radical, pushing a little bit over critical literacy, we are going to work with deaf people and having them engage in conditions that are obstacles for them, to dismantle those obstacles, but you need to understand what they are, not as only naming them, but as immersed historical beings in that process. Know historically where and how those obstacles came to being. And this is a very way of looking at literacy to basically approach that. So critical deaf studies, which I basically propose, is a fusion of critical pedagogy, conscientização, critical radical literacy, and deaf studies. There is a framework that we are going to lead to investigate, to have what are the oppressive forces that engage in the lives of deaf people, how do they force affect their lives, and how the evolving forms of intersectionality impact deaf individuals. So there's new ways. So we have a group of deaf people that we talk about very heterogeneity, but many times people want to perceive that they're only deaf. No, we have deaf and blind. We have deaf and physical limitations, and also other roles in society. So new intersectionalities. Now I mentioned to you that we have deaf scholars. So there were only perhaps before females and deaf. Now they are professors, females, deaf. So there are different intersectionalities evolving all the time. So you wanted to have deaf finding their voice through the silence, not basically punish them from the silence, but understand that silence is an important cultural mark. And I want us to interrogate the limits of our disciplinary identities and the notion of working what we call collaborative unknownness. And so the new direction, that is the title of our panel today, the new direction in and for critical pedagogy, I want us to think about deconstructing the notion of silence. Silence as a liberation, as emancipation, as a political representation. Silence as a voice for agency. Silence as a cultural mark for deaf people through the very sign language that they engage with. Critical pedagogy and the work of Paulo Freire through conscientização and radical literacy can be the theoretical base, and can also form a methodological approach to it. And the fusion of critical pedagogy and deaf studies that will lead to critical deaf studies is going to provide, hopefully, a deaf community with agency, empowerment, transformation of oppressive political situations, an opportunity for them to reconstruct their own history, claim their own future, accept of the difference and the diversity, and respect the deaf experience and the humanity as much as the diversity of humankind. Obrigada.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I also need to thank you a lot of people. Thank you for coming. I thank you, Professor Handel, for the invitation and making this possible. Vanessa for thinking I could say something interesting. I hope not to disappoint her. Anna for sharing what should have been an individual presentation with a panel one or a dialogical one. Sam for welcoming me to this university a couple of weeks ago. And my colleague Barbara Weber, who invited me to be here as visiting professor. And I will not, I don't have a PowerPoint, neither a written text. The PowerPoint may be because, as Anna said, I'm not Brazilian, but I am Latin American, and I've been living in Brazil for the last 20 years. I arrived to Brasilia, to the University of Brasilia, as visiting professor in May 1997, just 2 days after Paulo Freire died. And I also prefer the oral to the written. And I think that something that is related to our task as teachers or professors has to do to invite the others to think or for thinking. And I prefer to do that in oral dialogue in written. And I also, because of the very practical thing, because my English read is much more unpleasant than I would say in that way. So I would like to save you to listen me reading. I would like to pose one question or a couple of questions, mainly if I would say in these terms, if emancipation is possible, if educational emancipation is possible, and if it is possible, how or where does it come from? So this would be the main question I would like to justify, and I will bring Paulo Freire and others to think about this question. This is also, I think, important in our relationship to Freire, which is usually, especially today in Brazil, is under attack or under defense. And these two positions, in a sense, are not very good for thinking. So neither when you attack, neither when you defend, you think so much. And I would like to honor Paulo Freire, not attacking nor defending him, but thinking together. So my main aim is to raise some elements in order to make this question meaningful about educational emancipation. And the first thing I would like to say is that emancipation is, in a sense, a paradox, because you might be familiar with the Latin root of the word emancipation that has to do with this man, has to do with manus, which is a Latin word for hand. So emancipation literally, etymologically means to take up the hand that takes you so that you can go for yourself and not taken by another's hand. And there's a kind of paradox in this notion, because it seems that a real emancipation needs yourself to emancipate for yourself. So if you really want to emancipate, you have to do that for yourself. But at the same time, if nobody helps you to move from the place you are, how are you going to move by yourself if you are already taken by others' hand? So it's a kind of paradox. So it's not so easy, so evident, so obvious that emancipation is possible or is meaningful. And I would say that Paulo Freire, in a sense, this has to do with the notion of conscientisation that Anna brought, which is a specialist, much more than me. That it seems that Paulo Freire gave an answer that is through conscientisation that we emancipate others. And Anna, in that chapter that she mentioned of 2013, show us that Paulo Freire distinguished about 3 dimensions or 3 levels of conscientisation or conscientization, and that just one of them was emancipating. Freire spoke about semi-transitive conscientisation, naive transitive conscientisation, and critical transitive conscientisation, and it was this one that was liberating or emancipating. But still, there are some doubts, mainly coming out from that word, precisely conscientisation, which has the conscience in it, it has the conscience. So in a sense, this idea that the process of conscientization, the educational process, brings to someone a kind of conscience that she didn't have before. So this is at the same, the power of emancipation, but at the same time what makes us question if it's really emancipation, because it seems that there is someone to have to help another to have what she didn't have before. So I will bring two other figures to think, to make it more complex, the problem. One is the French Jacques Rancière. I don't know if you are familiar with his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which is a book about emancipation, which tells the story about the French teacher of the 19th century. I think, realize at what time did I begin? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
How much more I have? 10 minutes? So in this story, Rancière tells us the story of Joseph Jacotot, who was invented or discovered a concept, a notion of emancipation through his own practice. And this emancipation for the ignorant schoolmaster had to do with equality as a principle. So for the ignorant schoolmaster, you can only emancipate others if you have equality as a principle of your educational practice, not as an end. And this is a kind of specific kind of equality. It's a quality of intelligence. So, as a teacher, if you start from believing in equality, believing because this is not an epistemological principle that you can prove, but it's like a fact, it's like an opinion. So if you believe in equality, you start from that, you are going to transmit this equality to your student, so they will go to learn that they are equally capable as anyone to think for themselves. And so in this sense, they are going to emancipate their intelligence from any other intelligence. The opposite. If you don't believe in equality, so if you think that in any respect you are, as teacher, in a higher position than your students, you will fix their intelligence to your intelligence, and you will stultify them, not allowing their intelligence to work as equally capable and to develop all the force that is capable of. For Rancière, for Jacotot, what makes the difference between an emancipating teacher and a stultifying one is that the emancipating only works on the will of the students in order they can realize of the equal capacity of their intelligence. While the stultifying schoolmaster, not relying on the intelligence of the students, work on it so that it follows the path that she thinks it should follow. So, I was afraid now because I turned on my notes and I saw like a silence. But it was that without realizing I wrote in the following page. Fortunately, I have the notes. So, the ignorant schoolmaster, the title of the book, has the ignorance there has a double sense. So the teacher is ignorant in a double sense. Is ignorant because she doesn't know what the student will learn, because she doesn't work on the content of the student's learning, but on the will. She wants the student to will to learn and to rely on her intelligence. So she's ignorant of what she will learn. But mostly she is ignorant in the sense not of not knowing, but in the sense of not accepting the inequality of intelligence that underlines any educational institution. So the teacher is ignorant because she doesn't know what the other will learn, but is ignorant because she doesn't want to accept, she knows, but she doesn't want to accept the inequality of intelligence that every institutional educational needs in order to develop its educational task of teaching something to somebody. So in this sense, Francis says, okay, so we have this ignorant schoolmaster, let's look for examples in the history of pedagogy, and someone could think about Socrates. Because Socrates, we know that he knew that he didn't know. So that was his knowledge. He was ignorant, apparently. But Francis says, no, you are wrong. It's the opposite. Socrates was the worst of the stultifiers. Why? Because underlying this Socratic ignorance, so Socrates knew very well what the other should learn. And if you read Socrates in Plato's early dialogue especially, you will find out that Socrates, all the people who talk to Socrates, who dialogue with Socrates, coincidentally, they all learn one and the same thing, that they really don't know what they think they knew. And this, coincidentally, is what Socrates already knows. This is Socrates' knowledge. So look at what kind of emancipator is Socrates. The one who knows what the others will know and only let the others live when they accept that they know what Socrates already knew. So it's not Socrates. But I would like to bring to the discussion another Socrates, which is Simón Rodríguez, the master, the teacher of Simón Bolívar, the Venezuelan, who was called by Bolívar the Socrates of Caracas. And why? Because remember that we are thinking this issue, what is emancipation about? Is it possible? And where does it come from? So one idea is Freire's idea of conscientization, and I question, I bring some doubts in terms of where does this conscience come from, because it seems that it comes from the teacher. There's something that can violate the main idea of emancipation. It cannot be something like Socrates, because in the name of ignorance we can transmit a given relationship or idea of knowledge, and more, we can transmit inequality of capacities of intelligence and knowledge. And these Socrates of Caracas, which created one of the first popular philosophical schools in Latin America, in Chuquisaca, the capital of Bolivia, in the 19th century, brings something that for me is precious, to think this idea of emancipation in terms of educational context. Simón Rodríguez kept saying, we invent or we err. We invent or we err. Inventamos o dejamos. So we invent or we err. Err is an ancient English word. Erring, that can have at least two meanings. One as a synonym of mistaken, err in the sense that I don't get the truth, I make a mistake. or erring in a sense of a kind of traveling, of displacing, where it's not that you don't know where to go, but that you leave the travel to show you the sense and the path to go across. So that an errant is someone who leaves the way, the path, to show you where to go. An invent or invention is also, comes from Latin, inventus. Invention today is very pronounced in neoliberal discourses on education, in the sense of creativity, of creation, and something that we must be inventors, or in the sense of creatives, and in the sense of something that comes from the inside to the outside. That is an inventive person would be someone that creates something new, or something that didn't exist before in the world. But Rodriguez gives to the word another meaning which is interesting for me, and especially I think for popular education. And it's close to the etymology of the word inventus. That has to do with the verb venire, to come. Ventus is the past participle of the verb venire, to come. And in, which means in, as in English, inside. So, inventus not necessarily means an activity, a creative activity from the inside to the outside, but might mean more than that, something that comes from the outside to the inside, that has come in, that has arrived. So, something that calls for attention, for hospitality, for openness. So this is a kind of different framework to think emancipation, not in terms of the capacity of an intelligence, but in terms of the sensitivity of a way of being in the classroom, if we are speaking about teachers. So these are the elements I wanted to bring, and in order to think the question. So, is emancipation possible? Where does it come from? Conscientisation, ignorance, and invention, hospitality, attention. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank my colleagues as well. Unlike the previous two, I'll be reading off a page. It's actually for similar commitments. I believe in the orality of language, and in particular the medieval practice of lexile, which is language that's read aloud and shared in public. So I'll take a more medieval approach, I suppose. In part because of some of the influences and conversations I've had with Anna and Walter recently, they've changed my title a bit, so I have a new subtitle. So the title remains The Personalism of Paulo Freire, but the subtitle is now a reply to the post-politicians and post-humanists. So I've added another series of people I'll be talking towards. The thought of Paulo Freire today is caught between two contemporary critiques. On one hand, in Brazil, a conservative group that calls itself Escola Sem Partido, School Without Party, threatens to revoke Freire's title as Brazil's patron of education and exile Freire, yet again, posthumously. The historian Thomas Giuliano has referred to Freire's ideas as, quote, intellectually and pedagogically genocidal, end quote, adding that, quote, to have Freire as a patron is a shame, end quote. These critics often refer to Freire's leftism and communism as among his more shameful defects. So that's one. On the other hand, in the United States, the emerging ideas of posthumanism have in their own way accused Freire of being complicit with similar harms. In Curriculum and Pedagogy, Nathan Snazz's article, Bewildering Education, also claims that Freire is guilty of a number of harms related to his supposed communism. Snazza claims that for Freire, quote, becoming more fully human thus means struggling for communism, end quote. Snazza goes on to reduce Freire's vision and pedagogy of the oppressed to a Marxian dialectic. And I say Marxian and not Marxist in this sense, for reasons I can't share, just because of time. This claim is then strengthened by Snazza, citing Corman, who asserts that, quote, Freire relies on reductive, fixed, and specious constructions of the animal and animality throughout the text of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, end quote. In protest, Snazza advocates for post-humanism as a ready replacement for Freire's naive and outdated humanism. While Giuliano and Snazza clearly occupy distinct and opposed ideological commitments, they each in their own way interpret Freire as a communist pure and simple, and attack the politics of his humanism as being intellectually and pedagogically harmful. Both critiques also situate themselves as beyond different things. Escola Sem Partido is ostensibly beyond politics, and posthumanism is beyond the human. This is why I refer to them as post-politicians and post-humanists. In these short remarks, I will try to demonstrate how the post-political and post-human critics of Freire fail in their critique and succeed in redeeming the relevance of Freire today. The chief failure I will refer to is the failure to understand the precise terms of Freire's humanism, which I will reconstruct, however briefly, through the lens of personalism. Most of all, in the idea of personalización, personalization, we find in the often ignored work of Miguel Unamuno, a Spanish philosopher whom Freire fondly recalls reading at the age of 19. Before delving into Freire's personalism, I should differentiate between the post-politicians and post-humanists in two directions that share a common problem of not reading. In the case of Giuliano and the post-politicians of Escola Sem Partido, there is a hollowness to their critique of Freire because it shows that they do not even remotely attempt to situate their critique in the context of Freire's written works. Their critique is mobilized through a farcical propaganda that tries to assert that Freire's ideas are nothing more than propaganda. At best, this is anti-propagandist propaganda. At worst, it is right-wing horseshit. Because of these brittle options, there is little to say directly to that position. We cannot have a disputation when one side is so clearly unwilling to listen and to read. In the case of Snazza and the post-humanists, their critique is mobilized through another hollowness that occurs in a different kind of misreading, namely the misreading of poor translation and monolingualism that plagues Anglophone interpretations of Freire well beyond the post-humanists. I would include most of Anglophone critical pedagogy amongst these misreaders. The evidence against the post-humanists is as follows. The passage that Snazza fixes his attention on is translated by Mayra Ramos to say, quote, the historical and ontological vocation of becoming more fully human, end quote. But the Portuguese and Spanish versions of that passage give a very different impression. In Portuguese, the same passage is na sua vocação ontológica e histórica de ser mais. In Spanish, it reads as en su vocación ontológica y histórica de ser más. In both cases, the English version clearly overstates the humanist sentiment and sense of the passage. What is lost is this italicized sense of ser mais, in English, to be more. Snazza and the posthumanists are so quick to move beyond the human that they badly neglect the proper use of human language, settling for a monolingual interpretation that badly mistakes Freire's italicized emphasis on to be more, with the unitalicized becoming more fully human as an overdressed Anglophone substitute. This misunderstanding is not a mere linguistic faux pas. It is also a telling sign of a more fundamental misunderstanding of Freire's particular sense of humanism. After all, there are many different and contested kinds of humanism, including humanisms that are opposed to other humanisms. A dismissal of one of them, such as Marxism, is not a dismissal of all of them. Freire himself seems to note this in a quixotic way in the preface of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he predicts that only Christians or Marxists will read his book to the end. I move closer now to my more constructive claim about the personalism of Paulo Freire. But first, what does this word personalism refer to? The tradition of personalism is hard to pin down in many respects, and I do not have time to do it justice now. But let's say that personalism is a seam or a crack in the tradition of existentialism that in many cases overlaps or grows alongside the tradition of phenomenology. In some cases, those described as personalists never took that name for themselves. But three of them who directly influenced Freire, which we can see in his direct citation of their works, are Martin Buber, Erich Fromm, and Karl Jaspers. There is a transcendental component to personalism, which Freire sums up nicely when he claims, in English, I situate myself amongst those who believe in transcendentality and do not dichotomize transcendentality with mundanity, or we could use the word worldliness for this idea of mundanity. This transcendental worldliness of Freire is shared by Emmanuel Mounier in his 1949 book, Personalism. Especially clear is their common rejection of individualism as a false form of humanism. Mounier writes, quote, if the first condition of individualism is the centralization of the individual in himself, the first condition of personalism is his decentralization, in order to set him in the open perspectives of personal life, end quote. This transcendental openness for Mounier is unique to the person as opposed to the individual, at least in part because personalism for Mounier and other personalists does not restrict personhood solely to humans. There are non-human persons in this tradition that range from gods to God to all of creation, as we find in the Franciscan tradition that celebrates the feast of its patron today. Decades before Mounier and his articulation of personalism, however, the overlooked works of Unamuno, who Freire described as a celebrated philosopher, amorous to un celebre filosofo amoroso, articulates all the major doctrines of Mounier's personalism, including the rejection of a simplistic and individualistic humanism. In a footnote to the introduction to Unamuno's Del Sentimiento Trágico de la Vida on the Tragic Sense of Life, originally published in 1912, Ernst Robert Curtius notes that Unamuno took great pains to avoid using the Spanish word humanismo, humanism, borrowing sometimes from the Portuguese to use the word hombridad instead. Unamuno's reluctance to even use the term humanism is on grand display in this translated passage from his opening chapter, Hombre de carne y hueso, man of flesh and bone. This is a short block quote. This is Unamuno. For me, the adjective humanus is no less suspect than its abstract substantive humanitas, humanity. Neither the human nor humanity, neither the simple adjective nor the substantive adjective, but the concrete substantive, man. The man of flesh and bone, the man who's born, suffers and dies, above all who dies, the man who eats and drinks and plays and sleeps and thinks and wills, the man who is seen and heard, the brother, the real brother, end quote. In the same chapter, Unamuno questions Aristotle's classical description of the human when he writes, that is Unamuno writing, quote, man, they say, is a rational animal. I don't know why he has not said that he is an affective and sentimental animal. Unamuno repeats themes like this across his works, and unlike Mounier and the other personalists, his personalism is first expressed in direct relation to education. In his 1902 novella, Amor y Pedagogía, Love and Pedagogy. For Unamuno, love and pedagogy are ontologically opposed. Pedagogy is the application of social science technique that objectifies the man of flesh and bone into a technical candidate for genius. The chief protagonist, literally the antagonist's name is Don Alvaro, who he says is a modern man in love with all social science. This is 1902. The chief protagonist in Amor y Pedagogía, Apollodoro, cries out to his beloved Clara in the final scene of the novella, he exclaims, quote, "You were able to redeem from pedagogy a man, to make a man from a candidate for genius. May you make men of flesh and bone, with the companion of your life, may you make them in love, in love, in love, in not in pedagogy." As we have seen, this man of flesh and bone, hombre de carne y hueso, is repeated throughout Unamuno's later philosophical works to follow. For him, the only force that can combat pedagogy is love. And the effect that love has is personalización, personalization, not humanization. This may best express Unamuno's anti-pedagogical personalism, and anyone vaguely familiar with Freire's opposition to the banking concept of education will hear the two ideas singing in direct harmony with each other. To ser más, to be more than, is thoroughly personalistic. It is to be more than a candidate for genius, to be more than a pedagogical human. It is to be personalized and thereby redeemed by love. In Freire's 1995 autobiographical text, A Sombra desta Mangueira, he recalls Unamuno, and I've translated this short passage. He says, "When I was very young, I read in Miguel Unamuno that ideas are possessed in beliefs one exists." Here we see again, and in closing, the personalism of Unamuno at work in the young heart and mind of Freire. Long before Freire would write against the concept of education that is about banking, about the possession of a student as a passive object, long before Freire would affirm his own belief in the transcendentality of love, opposed to a humanism that individualizes or dichotomizes, one of those influences, long before this time, is the personalism of Unamuno, which we can also, in this respect, call the personalism of Paulo Freire. This personalism is nowhere to be found in the critiques of the post-politicians of the New Right in Brazil, nor the post-humanists of the New Left in the United States. Indeed, both critiques not only fail to understand Freire's personalism, they also wildly succeed in showing the continued significance and durability of the need to ser más, to be more than humans, to become personalized in love, in love, in love, and not in pedagogy.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Andreotti. My task is to respond, and there were no texts sent in advance apart from yours. Your text sent yesterday as well. In the evening. So it's a huge task. So I'll just comment on some of my notes about each of the papers and see how it goes. And how long do I have?
It's up to you.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yes, and then we can have an engagement, sure.
Yeah.
As long as you want to take, you can take up to 15, you can take as little as 5. It's your show.
Okay. So Anna, first of all, thank you so much for educating us about ASL, about deafhood, and for enabling us to meet some of the people who are part of the struggle. At one point I thought, is she going to really prioritize the deaf people struggle over Paulo Freire? And if she is, that's a good call. We did that. We did that here. I think we would need a day with you at least to try to have a glimpse of the kind of work we're doing. So thank you for showing that to us. What I found most interesting in your presentation is this space between questions of representation and questions of representability. So this in-between space between questions of epistemology and the gestures towards ontology, and what happens when we mix both of them. Because I think in terms of horizons of hope, for example, for all of us, they are deeply ingrained in the historical and political possibilities that we're living right now. And in that sense, questions of agency, of voice and empowerment will make sense in modern institutions that we still have before us. But these institutions are also cracking and collapsing. And I think the concept of deafhood as opposed to deafness already gestures in the direction of new possibilities, of hospicing a world that is in crisis and gesturing towards assisting with midwifering a world that is yet to be born, that is undefined, potentially wiser, but not necessarily. So this re-enchantment that happens in this middle space, I think, is what your presentation evoked in me, in this eagerness or hunger to know more. So thank you for that. And there's one more thing, the idea of bringing Freire towards the end to show how it's part of a larger conversation without elevating Freire as a canon or using Freire as a commodity, which is very common in the United States, was also something that I would like to comment on. In Brazil, I think it is in the realm of either defending or attacking. There's not in between. That's the intellectual economy we participate in. In the United States, it's a similar economy, but different in terms of mobilizing people as this canonical figures as commodities that serve in the production of value in relation to your own career as an academic. You have certain currencies that you have to use and deploy in certain ways. And the ways that Freire has been translated into English, which are very problematic, actually it's in the translation into this economy where I think the problem lies. So from there, the questions about the ignorant schoolmaster, you actually, Walter, you gave me a very different way of understanding it. I really love the way you looked at the etymology of the words and left the ambiguity there, especially in terms of invention and error, erring. I felt that both invention and erring can be read as invitations to allowing the world to take you, or the world to enable different possibilities within you, and in that way, again, gesturing towards ontological questions and moving away from questions of knowledge. But my only concern there is that when we do it too quick, sometimes what gets left aside are questions about how knowledge mobilizes inequalities too. So it's not just in the capacity to know, but how knowing is mobilized to reproduce these inequalities. I'm thinking about, then back to Freire, questions about who decides in whose name, for whose benefit, and how come. I've seen a lot of the times Rancière mobilized too quickly into ontological questions in ways that leave questions of power and the historicity and the systematic nature of the production of inequalities hanging, so that we can go more into questions of existence. And I think we need a balance probably in there. I don't think you did that. I think actually what you're offering is a way around it to then split it and to keep both in front of us, not to turn your back to one in order to go to the other. The discussion on emancipation is very much in that direction. I think in terms of my discussions about separability and entanglement that are common in indigenous studies, for example, there is a sense in which I think the ignorant schoolmaster has been mobilized to talk about self-sufficiency and independence, but there's a question about also our insufficiency and interdependence with others that is not necessarily addressed when we ask that question, but I think that it needs to be there.
Interdependence and?
Insufficiency, our sense of entanglement with each other. So instead of talking, maybe it's my frustration with questions of deficit and autonomy, that this discussion that has been, it's either there's a deficit or we're whole and there needs an autonomy. Maybe like we need to step back and go back to what Sam was doing, which was taking us to another ontological position where there is a wider organism that we're part of that includes both humans, non-humans, more than humans, where time and space and form are thought about in very different ways, and where you can talk about love in that way, love as the creative force that both creates and destroys things and that moves things. So when we are in that position, questions change. Maybe we are insufficient, interdependent, and indispensable for this wider organism that we all belong to, and that may be right now dysfunctional in many ways. And the question of individuality and personalization that Sam was presenting to us, I love the way, Sam, that you dance around this concept and you take the Freire's gestures and rearrange them in ways that take people back to love. I knew that it was going to end in love. And I knew you were doing your dance of selecting things that would take us to where to this ontological question. So yeah, Freire is very ambivalent and ambiguous. My encounter with Freire also at a very important point in my life, in my teacher education in Brazil, shows me that there are many different Freires, and he was a very complex man, full of multiplicities inside, and also living in a specific point in time, in a specific political context, and responding to it from the heart of its plurality and possibility. So in that sense, for me, the geniality of Freire is in his spontaneity and the integrity of what he was doing, rather than, I don't know, the relevance of the canonical figure for education today, right? So if we can see Freire as this complex man who challenged everything, even in his personal life, with his life history with Nita and his first wife, you have so much there happening, and what was possible for him to question and to challenge at different points in time also attests to the openness of this man to live in the world, live in the present, and allow the world to invite him into different things. I think that's the gift of Freire. And that love that you're talking about, if you read Freire's project at the macro level, his life was reflective of that love for being in the world, love for holding the paradoxes, for working with the contradictions, for making mistakes, for erring in both senses of the world, are very much part of what he did. So from the beginning, I think the post-humanists talk about his anthropocentrism, and there is some damage that he did there too in relation to indigenous people in Brazil when he talked about them as pre-rational or non-rational people, together with all the gains that the peasants have had with his methodology. We can't, I think our desire for a hero or for a coherent person that will meet this geniality, this canonical geniality, is basically the problem we're dealing with here. If we see him as the man who he was actually treading a path, walking the spotty road, making mistakes, failing, learning from it, coming back again, and falling in love, I think that we're back to to its relevance, to what we can do today as we face a very different context, where all the institutions that were pretty solid when Freire was alive are now cracking, and some of them collapsing in very violent ways. So thank you, the three of you, and thank you, Handel, for organizing the panel. I was very surprised and taught by the panel today. It's not, I don't know if we have this depth of conversation very often, and I would like to see it more often. I feel nourished by what happened this afternoon, and I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So now we've got quite a bit of time for questions, for people's thoughts. Yes.
Your presentations are very amazing. My question is first to Anna, then to Walter. Yes. You said that silence is not deafness, and then you talked about the heterogeneity of deaf language. I would like to know, then I'll say the last one. You wanted to, let me just say something. When you said that deafness is not, silence is not deafness. In the little language, little village I grew up in Africa, there were some deaf children, but nobody called them deaf at all. And nobody cared whether they are making sign or not. We just speak the language to them. And what I realized, I left early to go to the city to school, but I realized later in life that those people became adults and they were speaking. It wasn't very clear, but they spoke like the village people. So that thing is very amazing to me. I kept asking the people, how did, because I grew up seeing them not speaking. That's just one question. And then when we are talking about not giving deafness names like they are deaf or something like that. We said, I've forgotten how you put it, that we should not dehumanize the people who are deaf. Then the little boy's video that you showed, he was very adamant in leaving them as they are. Then my mind went to the present day children who are not deaf at all. They are trying to be deaf by putting all those things, by just owning themselves with their gadgets. So where is science in all this? What are people trying to do to put them together just as us and not giving them names? I'm sure it's what the little boy saw. People are ostracizing them. That's why he said they are. Or what is science and what are academia, like you guys, doing to make sure we humanize them, we put them as us and not ostracize them? Are you answering it now or later? Okay, maybe I just go to him. And then Walter was talking about something that comes from outside. I didn't understand. He said, I think intelligence comes from outside, not from the inside, that invention comes from without. If you could just enlighten me on that, I didn't get it. That intelligence comes from outside. I've been thinking, how do I see that cup as a cup? It's only through the brain, and other things don't work within me to add to that. I don't know that. That's my question. Those are my questions.
Yes. Comfort. Just let me see if I...
Comfort.
Comfort. let me see if I understood your question. So
Yes.
I wanted to make sure that I addressed. You asked me about that silence is not deafness.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that deaf people are not embarrassed, are not ashamed to not speak. Silence is part of who they are. And you should not be forcing them just to use the spoken language because it is for our advantage, normally hearing people, to basically have that communication mode with them. If you look at the history of deaf education or deaf people, you're going to see about the whole aspect of what it is that we call normality. You know, how you define normality, how it is. It goes all back to Comte, when basically we look at what is normal. So it was perfectly okay until about the 1600s to be deaf, and deaf was considered just a diversity of humanity. It was okay to be deaf, and that are records that in the 1500s, even the 1500s England, deaf people were married. The ceremony was performed through sign language, between deaf and deaf, and between deaf and hearing. So it was okay. So it was later with the industrialization and the perception and the construction, what is normal, what was normal has to be abnormal, right? So what was abnormal then was considered pathology. So as you consider pathology, then you need to fix it, you need to cure it. So that comes to the end, the age of industrialization and technology, that we have more cochlear implants, we have more hearing aids, and this is not something that it is, even though you say it's for the benefit of the deaf, but you are looking at what is it that the deaf people threat us about, what is a threat that they portray to us. We don't sign, yeah, so teachers are more comfortable in having to teach them how to speak than actually to learn how to sign. Does it make sense?
Yes, yes.
So the whole idea of what it is that you do to respect one another, that process of humanization, in the name of humanization, you actually have committed very serious violence. In the name of education, that normalization of when education became normalized. Talk about the special education and all. This was one of the most sign of violence that we have done for quote-unquote disabled and deaf people, because we start categorizing them. Less they hear, less human they were, less they could become, less they could develop, less they could be part of the society. It was up to us to decide for them. And we should do that. Make sense?
Yes.
Thank you, Comfort, for the question. The context of these notes on intelligence and invention, where this question concerning emancipation, and mainly the, let's say, the political task of a teacher, of an educator. So what's a kind of politically interesting place or way of being a teacher, of putting oneself in this place of someone who has the pretension to teach someone to someone. And the idea of invention, I compare like two ways of understanding it. So, and I said that we usually think of an inventive person as someone who brings things from the inside to the outside. So he's inventive in the sense that he brings something to the world. And in this sense, the opposite idea of being inventive in the sense of being open to the world, or sensitive or attentive to the outside, might be interesting in this idea of thinking the political position of the educator, in the sense that it takes out from this idea that we think that there's something in the teacher that it has to go to the students or to the other, that teaching means giving something that is in myself or first, so that the other can change this, can take out of this. And also related to this idea that Vanessa was saying, that inventing or erring, so it also takes out of an intelligence that has to do with telling or not the truth, to being right or being mistaken. But it's more about teaching as a kind of travel, as a kind of erring. This was very meaningful in the case of Freire and Darillo, in the sense of, so that, and if we think about that, not only in terms of physically moving, not only in the sense of traveling, that displacing from one place to another, this idea that teaching might has not mainly to do with neither giving something that I have, neither bringing the other to a place that she's not occupying now, but myself being able, through sensitivity to the outside, to displace myself to where I am, to somewhere else. So this is the idea of, it's not like a technical or epistemological idea of intelligence, but it's more like a political understanding of what it could mean to teach, or displacing teaching from the inside to the outside.
Okay. Yes.
Can I say something? And I think, as Walter is saying, when I was putting that presentation together, I went to the etymology of the word. So it's a challenging thing, and I'm very puzzled. It's a paper becoming. It's not already a paper that is ready yet. And more I work on it, more it becomes complex, because I look at the etymology of the word pedagogy, right? And I think I mentioned in the beginning that critical pedagogy is something fluid. A lot of people try to really define and confine, but if you look at the word pedagogy, it's exactly what Walt is saying, is to lead. You know, you lead a child somewhere. So when you lead whom, where, when. So that contextuality should be really present at all times. And that idea of etymology, epistemology, when I look at deaf studies and cultural studies, as Vanessa was saying, I really intentionally push Freire a little bit to the background, because I want us to see a new way that he could reinvent, if you could call a reinvention, of what critical pedagogy could be as we merge fields, because it is very difficult to look, for example, as words as praxis, using deaf studies. I do not know if they are applying the meaning of praxis, even though I know he most likely he read Freire as he, bring from Freire because he read Freire, excuse me. Is he using the same context? Is he applying that based on the experiences he had, the same way that a normally hearing person would use that? So etymology, epistemology is a big issue that I'm facing as I look at those fields. And it's challenging, but it is enriching, you know? So the idea is, how much are we questioning ourselves in the disciplines that you basically carry, or interdisciplines that you carry? When we call ourselves pedagogues, how much in a cage are we within our fields and within the context of our time? How are we leading or not leading? So those are all questions that I'm asking myself, you know?
Yes. Questions? I would be lost. Oh, you would be lost. Did you answer?
Yeah. Two things. First of all, as a Brazilian, I can't avoid mentioning how cool your t-shirt is.
Sorry?
Your t-shirt. My t-shirt is damaged. Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Second thing, I have a question for Professor Sam, which is, I am very aware of the whole escola sem partido, but I'm not at all aware with this post-humanism in the United States. So my question is, in which way, the way they understand Freire is problematic because of the translation to English, or is the failing understanding transcendence is a political project?
It's just both and. I can just, to be quick, I have a piece in a short essay in the Queen's Education Letter, which is a very general look at post-humanism and a kind of critique of it as a kind of false theology. And then there's a piece coming out in Curriculum and Pedagogy where Ugo Letice, who is a sociologist in the UK, as a Marxist, took huge offense to SNAS's critique of Freire for being a communist. So they had it out, and the editor was like, "We have this terrible fight on our hands. Do you want to be like a third, kind of the third wheel?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not? I mean, I disagree with both of them, so might as well, right?" And that's coming out very soon, where I think I'll outline more or less clearly the claim. I don't want it to be reducible to just an issue of language and translation, but I do want to note the fact that part of the problem with the canonical Freire is actually the fact that we don't really have a conversation in the field about translation that takes the language seriously. Imagine a field where, for instance, the Stambach translation of Heidegger of 1996 that replaced the old Robinson McQuarrie. It was a huge, monumental event in the field of philosophy. Imagine any other field where a canonical figure would only have one translation in a language point. It's a farce. It would be ridiculous. I mean, Foucault's, the writings from the Collège de France that came out, in the 2010s was a monumental event. We don't have these monumental events, I would claim, and here I'm going to go above the question and say, because there's not really a humanities culture in the field of education that's so driven by technical, social scientific research. And so we don't think about language, we don't think about translation, we don't think about books even often. And so a lacking of a book culture commits these errors, because the errors one makes with Marx are ostensibly related to his books as well, right? So for me, there's a problem with the post-humanist critique. And Nathan, I admire a great deal because Nathan teaches at the University of Richmond and he teaches literature. So as much as he and I disagree, and as much as we're at odds with each other on the arguments here, and as much as he has rejoinders that I haven't been generous towards to make in response to me, what we do agree on, though, is the fact that this is an argument that needs to be made out in the open, in the journals, and that we need to call people back to books. So I would say it's actually, the bigger problem is the fact that Freire is instrumentalized as a methodological or theoretical or pedagogical technical apparatus rather than being read as an author with poetry, literature, all of these works. That's where I would put my emphasis.
Questions? Are you ready to go now, Andre?
Thanks very much for the three presentations, absolutely inspiring, and I want to play on the inspiring. It's a counter of inventive, but it is a welcoming of a certain spirit of thought, so I appreciate this. I have two comments. I'm not sure they are questions, but perhaps you can relate to them. I think the first one, I think in a way I understood and read and heard and listened, I hope, to these three presentations as a dance around the term of humanity and humanism, and etc. In a way, one could read it this way. And then when I think about it, whether one addresses the critique of humanism or supports it, I think one would have to take into consideration within a particular semantic field the different variations of the term. So you have humanism, humility, transhumance, what did I write? Exhumation, inhumation. It's not just the word humanism. And I think that if one wants to approach a critique of humanism, one needs to go a little bit into the horizontal semantic field in which this word is complemented by other things. So humanity and humility would have to be related in some meaningful way. So if you could a little bit elaborate on that. And the second comment is what I found absolutely thought-provoking, is that from my reading, I saw really three completely different entries to the same problematic. Like when I heard Anna's point about silence, and again, I don't want to go to the Latin etymology or whatever etymology it is, a stillness and calmness, right? Walter's point about inventive, he explains, that resonated with Hannah Arendt's terms of visitation, which has its own genealogy with St. Augustine, etc. When I listen to Sam's point about love as to be more, it's all about, I saw a convergence of three completely different concepts from three completely different lenses into this idea of an internality that is often missed in our pedagogic discourse, and particularly in critical pedagogy. So if one could elaborate on this in however ways, that would help us a little bit ground the things. Thank you very much. And thanks to the speakers.
Audrey, just one clarification. Silence, love, and what was the second one?
Oh, inventiveness, right? Walter's point.
I can begin. Andre,
yeah.
Thanks so much for your inspiring comments also, because this idea of linking invention and visitation and Hannah also brings me to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks had two words for child. One is pais, from where it comes pedagogy, that means the conduction of the child. Pais, that is related to feeding. We have in Spanish, for example, pasto, which is like food. So pais is the one who receives the food. So pedagogy is bringing to the one. And the other word is neos, which we have in neoliberalism. Neos, which literally means the new. And this is, I came to this because of Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt says education has to do with the way we receive the new. So these are two ideas that I think that are very inspiring to think in education, and if we see it, or pedagogy, if we see it in history, that there are like two different ways. Either we see the child as someone who needs to be fed or conducted, or even we see the child as someone who is bringing the new, something new. So this is very close to the idea of discipline and invention, and I think that it gives two political words very different to the task of an educator. If we see the child either as someone who needs to be fed or to bring the new, and it's not just this or that, it's not exclusive, it's not that, it's not a dualistic process. Thank you so much.
Very interesting question, and silence, inventiveness, and love. And if you look at the inventiveness from that perspective of bring something new, the way I would like us to see what was presented today is to combine those three terms and think about Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy. I want us to look at the new possibilities without fear. So the silence was, for me, a metaphor, if you will, even though a metaphor that is very much ingrained in the being of certain groups, you know, as a metaphor for us to see there is so much out there that you, quote unquote, do not hear. There is so much out there that you don't understand. And you can bring that in a way that is not an imposition, that is not top-down, but that is bringing love. It is, there is a term that Freire used, and the translation in English is unafraid, okay? Which is different from fearless love. It's unafraid love, which is more, in my understanding, the way I could translate it into English, is a love that is more genuine, that has not yet, if you will, faced fear. It is open. It is unafraid of exploring. It's not fearless, but it's willing to go forward. Like a child would go, being led. Not basically being told, but be led to understand. something that perhaps you don't even know how to name it yet. So the field of deaf studies is something that most hearing have never heard of. And you are confronted every day with deaf people in our classes. How much do we know what they can do? That is a question we should be asking ourselves. And if you are critical pedagogues, how much will we invest in that investigation? So, here's all.
They're great comments. I don't know. I don't feel very confident with what to do with the first in terms of linguistic field. Just because if we take that field seriously, we have to multiply it by every language that exists, that has ever existed, every dialect. I get really confused at a certain scale of that. So I think it's meaningful, though, not so much to try to reproduce some kind of perfect picture of a linguistic field, but I think the attentiveness to the field of language is probably more of where I would lean. So in the same sense of, or in the spirit of my response to Mateus's question, I don't think it's, we need the best translation or we need a correct translation, but that we need to talk about the translation and we need to translate and that we need to be aware that we're reading in translation, which sometimes when I teach Freire, I have to remind students that like, oh, by the way, we're not really reading Freire, we're reading Mayra Ramos, you know, her account of Freire, which is interesting in and of itself. And this, so for me, the field of language, or the linguistic field, in relation to Freire in an Anglophone academy, would be much more the field of translation as a phenomenon than a particular linguistic field. To the second point, I mean, Vanessa was very generous, and all of you have been very generous. But I mean, this paper is like it dissolves under its own weight if you want to press against almost any edge of it. You could say, well, why does Freire use the word humanism instead of the word personalism if you claim that he's a personalist and not a humanist? Or, you know, there's a number of analytic problems with this paper, but I don't particularly care. My reason for composing the paper is actually to show there's a certain carelessness of Freire's work that is not so much interested in the linguistic field in the first sense, but deeply committed to a kind of poesis, I would say. And this is a poesis I don't think we understand in the modern sense of poetry, which is very kind of laissez-faire, creative, you know, this kind of thing. But perhaps a more ancient sense of poesis where the poet was the one who had wit. And this is why one finds poetry in the face of politics. This is why politicians always kill the poets first. Poets, then philosophers, then everyone else. Right? Social scientists don't get killed. They get put to work, right? They go to work. But the poets have to be killed first with the artists and then the philosophers. And so, I mean, you know, I think of this verse from Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, where set me as a seal on your heart, set me as a seal on your soul. Strong as death is love. Unyielding as the grave, nothing can quench its flame. Nothing can quench its flame. This kind of idea of love is not reducible to an analytic account of humanism in or out of its linguistic field. As far as I'm concerned, my major response to the post-humanist is basically fuck you, right? I have no patience whatsoever for this idea that one should give a profound rehearsal of the analytic limits of love in relation to the project of Paulo Freire. No, this is simply, in some ways, in some ways I would put them right next to the conservatives in Brazil on this. Obviously they have very polite liberal politics, they voted for Hillary Clinton, they don't like Trump, sure. But I actually see the violence in their approach to thinking about Freire as a kind of analytical violence against the spirit of the project, which is not Paulo Freire himself, which I love that no one here is insisting on. I'm not afraid. I'm more interested in Freire precisely because at this time and in this moment, he provides a kind of poesis that's clearly being misread by people who like him and don't like him. And so that would be my sense of love. It's a slightly iconoclastic, but deeply committed to the project of poesis, first and foremost.
I just have one question. You mentioned something about Freire being careless. Did you mean careless with his language?
No. I mean, whenever you so there's a way of playing guitar, where so like a classical guitar player often has nails. so that their attack is even. And they'll often have the nails manicured so that every finger is identical in its attack. And so you hear there's very beautiful projections that have a very even dynamic response across the movement. And then there are people like Wes Montgomery or Django Reinhardt who play with a carelessness, which means A, they don't have nails, they're playing with their flesh and their bones. But B, Django Reinhardt didn't have all his fingers on his hand. And so you learn to adapt the hand to the strings and the fretboard. You become sensitive to how your guitar is feeling that day. And this isn't emotional bullshit. I mean, your guitar under certain weather conditions is going to be a little bit tighter, a little bit looser. It's going to have more projection towards the fretboard, towards the bridge. And you build this relationship. And I think in order to have that relationship, one needs to be careless. I use profanity in a very careful, careless way, right? It projects a very particular kind of carelessness that at the same time shows that I'm very attentive to the rhetoric of my presentation. And I think this is where wit and the poetic sensibility really emerges and allows for education to actually overcome pedagogy at a certain point. That would be my thanks.
We're almost at the end of things. Okay, we're almost at the end of things. And I guess a kind of concluding thought of mine. Okay, first of all, I should and Anna, thanks for doing that. I thanked not only the department but Alex Wozni in particular. She's just amazing. She just put all of this together, the ad for all of this. I just have like almost like a final thought going bum bum bum. I'm doing a reduced version of Vanessa's reduced version of things, and yes, really reducing it. And in order to show that I'm really drawing on Vanessa, I mean, one of the most important things said today was, Vanessa's point about how can we make almost this my translation of it. How can we make Freire ordinary in a way, right? How can we not treat Freire as canonical, which we have failed in from the beginning, from my very putting this together and saying Freire for today, right? So it's almost like we have no other way of taking up Freire. So Freire is the father. So we either go with the father or we rebel against the father. This is in some ways, this is in some ways what we end up almost attempting to do. But I just want to say that in each of these pieces I'm hearing something. I think Anna hasn't worked it through. Anna has one of the most interesting questions for the field of cultural studies, which is, can you take on board Paulo Freire? Can you take on board, not critical pedagogy attempting to become cultural studies, but can you take on board seriously the work of somebody like Paulo? Because I've seen her present at cultural studies conferences and people are just like, oh, we don't know what to do with this, right? So I think that is something that remains as a huge project. With Walter's project, in some ways there's a North American equivalence of what you're asking, which is the project of emancipation, which we talked about empowerment. There was, maybe you can go and look at this, the feminist rebellion against the father, right? Magda Lewis's at that time, very famous essay, A Discourse Not Intended for Her, which was the beginning of the feminist rebellion against Freire, well, not so much even Freirean at that stage, because Freire was only the kind of like the head stream. What you're really doing is critical pedagogy. How can you force me to be liberated? Which is what people felt like they were being asked to do as feminists in a classroom. So that was like and there's books, there's other stuff that came after it, but that was the beginning of it in North America. And for Sam, I hear your point about translation. I think this is really, really important. But it almost reminds me of people's idea about, about education when it comes to things like racism. If only people were, I'm not saying you're saying that, if only people were educated about Muslims, there would be less Islamophobia or something. It's not about the correct translation of Freire so much. It is not, it's another kind, there's a politics, there's an irrational anti-Marxist, anti-communist sense of being American, right? Which people will use anything to marshal, including taking up Freire wrongly. So part of this is, there's part of something like that going on. So there's this paradox, which I'm left with, which is to broad paradox, but the paradox that Vanessa has introduced for us here. How can we not take up Freire in education, in cultural studies, but how can we not take him up as canonical? Because even cultural studies, which claims not to do the canonical, does its Gramsci onto Foucault, onto Derrida, onto Zizek, all the boys lined up, right? But we claim we don't do canons. Of course we do canons, right? So this panel and our reaction is beginning to point to the solution, but it's part of the problem. That's what we have done. We have enacted the very problem we're trying to say we want to avoid, which is we have treated Freire in some ways. In many ways, we try to humanize him and whatever, but we have made it canonical. And I am the first to say, yes, I drew it up. Freire for today. Yes. So how do we do this differently? Is it strategic canonization to bastardize Spivak or what? But I think this is the beginning of a discussion of maybe pointing to a new way, slowly maybe beginning to take up Freire somewhat differently. And I hope it's something that really continues, because I think a lot of this was very, very rich. I want to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you.
I think I said one sentence.
My
Yes.